My name is Sharron Lovell. I've been looking at the impacts of the world's largest water project. There's been quite a lot of reporting on the environmental and the economic impacts, but much less on the human impacts. Back when I was studying photography over 10 years ago, my thesis project was actually to photograph the towns, cities, and villages that were about to be flooded by China's Three Gorges Dam. It was a mammoth project in many ways, both in terms of the economic costs, the environmental costs, and the human costs. And somewhere between 1 and 2 million people were relocated. As I was photographing, I saw firsthand the kind of rights violations and human impacts that, these huge water projects have on local populations. Today, over a decade later, that project is still plagued with problems. At the same time, huge water projects are still being built and planned in China. And a year ago, water started to course from China's south to its north along the central channel of this huge water transfer project. 4/5 of the country's water resources actually lie in the south. The past couple of decades of rapid urbanization, growth, and climate change too have depleted China's northern water supplies to crisis level. Thousands of rivers and lakes have dried up, groundwater's been totally overexploited and overextracted, and what little water is left is seriously polluted. But the north desperately needs water because that's where a lot of the industrial and energy production is concentrated. China's solution to all of this is a huge water transfer. Actually, the whole project involves three routes. I'm just looking at the central one. An eastern route was completed a couple of years before, and one in the west is still in planning stages and may or may not go ahead. That western route is much more complicated technically. It's a much higher economic and human cost, and it's a lot more controversial. It would also have potential impacts on China's neighbouring countries. For the Central Channel alone, official numbers of people to be forcibly relocated are at 350,000. Other people report and have told me that that number is more like over 500,000. Either way, it's a lot of people. Early on in the reporting, I met Cao Zhou, who's a fisherman on the Danjiangkou Reservoir, which is the starting point for the whole water transfer. I started to follow him because his story seemed to encapsulate some of the complexities of the story. So I started filming him about a year ago to try to explore some of the broader and long-term impacts of this water transfer project. This guy has been forced to relocate 3 times before in his childhood as a teenager and then again in 2009. And each time he's had to completely rebuild his life from scratch. In the last move, his village was moved 200 kilometers away from the water, and his home and his small fish processing business were all torn down at the same time of the village. Tal's wife and his grandchildren moved to the new village, but Tal actually moved back onto his little tin boat so that he could keep fishing and keep supporting his family. I wanted to follow this story because I think the real local costs of these projects are often underreported. Earlier relocations have left a legacy of poverty, and it's not just those relocated that suffer. In the last 2 decades, while most of the rest of China boomed, this region endured a 15-year development freeze so that its water quality would be protected. Very little infrastructure has been built there, industry hasn't been developed. There's essentially no investment there, and the whole economy has stagnated. To add insult to injury, this year fish farming in the reservoir was declared polluting, and by the end of the year, all fish cages are going to be pulled from the reservoir. Cao Suizhou and thousands of others are going to all lose their livelihoods. And Tao probably has very little choice other than to start farming, which will slash his income to around $1,000 a year, which is, 10% of what he can earn if he's fishing. Tal's a really stoic man, and sometimes it was difficult to get him to talk about anything other than the pragmatic. But towards the end of the reporting, I found out that his daughter had spent 6 months in hospital the previous year having treatment for cancer. Now, this has pretty much wiped out all of their savings, and he's really worried about the future. The government has painted the project as a small sacrifice for the greater good, and what I really wanted to do was draw out some of the broader and longer term implications that these projects have.